Welcome. My name is Randy Williams, and thank you for joining us to celebrate and learn about the remarkable career of our friend and society leader, Timothy Lloyd. Can you all hear me? Is that? No. I don't think this mic's on to them, but it's on to you. So
no, it's on. It's on.
Okay. Oh,
go close.
I'm Randy Williams. I'm the Fife Folklore Archives Curator and Oral History Director at Utah State University Library. And today's session is being recorded and will be available at Indiana University Scholar Works with links to the American Folklore Society, Utah State University Collecting Voices, Oral Histories of American Folklorists collection. Collecting Voices is a robust initiative that Tim, Michael Taft, and I launched in 2010 that includes audio, transcripts, and images from society leaders like Barry Tolkien, William A. Burt Wilson, and Carol Edison. It also serves as an aggregate of interviews with folklorists held at other repositories, including interviews conducted by Jeannie Hara Johnson at Indiana University Center for the Study of History and Memory, Oral History, Oral History, Scholars of Feminism collection compiled by AFS Women's Section Oral History Project, available at Minds at UW repository at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the interviews housed at the American Folklife Center that Ann Hogue organized. If you're interested in contributing an interview with a mentor or a colleague, or supplying USU with metadata of an interview that's held at another repository, please let me know. Tim's collaboration with USU did not begin with the Collecting Voices project. Tim and Utah State go back over 27 years. As the AFS Secretary-Treasurer in 1987 to 1991, he worked with the Society to solicit and select a repository for the Society papers. In 1991, USU was selected as the official repository, and Tim served on the faculty of the Fife Conference several times over the years. However, Tim's greatest, and I would say most cherished connection to Utah State is Barbara.
True words.
I first met Tim in 1992 at a Fife Folklore Conference on foodways, and I was impressed with Tim's fieldwork, his scholarship, and his passionate presentations. And I appreciated how approachable Tim was and how approachable he is. In 2002, I flew into Dayton, Ohio to visit with Tim and Barb prior to the AFS meeting in Columbus. And Tim picked me up from the airport. And as we drove back into the city, we were talking about our families and folklore, but also about the position that he had applied for as the executive director of the society, a rebooted position of the secretary-treasurer. And during the conference, Tim, Barb, and I went out to dinner, and it was then that Tim and Barbara told me that he had actually received that position and how ecstatic I recall the three of us being. As the archival liaison for our society, I worked closely with the executive director, and I had a great working relationship with Shalom Staub, the outgoing secretary-treasurer, back in 2000. But I was so delighted to have a chance to work with Tim, who brought great institutional memory to this position. Tim also brought his august strength as a mediator, a shrewd businessman, a scholar, a statesman, a fiscal manager, and a friend. At the time, I did not realize how Tim's friendships would shape our society. You cannot walk down the halls at this meeting without Tim being stopped. And not just by society members, but by students, visiting scholars, folklore fellows, artists, hotel staff members. Tim is approachable. He makes time for everyone. He truly is everybody's friend. So today, the 19th of October, at the Marriott City Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the American Folklore Society, the AFS Archives and Library Section, and the AFS History Section are pleased to present an interview with Dr. Timothy Lloyd with Dr. Michael Ann Williams. Michael Ann is a professor and department head of folklore studies and anthropology at Western Kentucky University and American Folklore Society past president, 2014 to 15. During the interview, Michael Ann will open up for some of your questions, and we ask you to please come up to the mic. Michael Ann and Tim.
Thank you. And I want to say how honored I am to be asked to do this interview. And this is an opportunity for Tim to sort of tell his own story. We heard a little bit about Tim from Bill Ivey last night, and so I thought what we would do in terms of questions was about halfway through. Although Tim has been executive director since, I believe, 2001, American Folklore Society, I thought we would start by focusing on Tim's earlier part of his life, since he did exist before he was the executive director. And so I thought there'd be a natural break then. We could take some questions and then kind of go on to more of the his AFS-related life. But I thought, Tim, maybe we'd start out by talking a little bit about who Tim Lloyd was before Tim Lloyd was a folklorist.
In the larval state, you have to understand, well, no. I'd be happy to, thank you. And thank you all for coming. Let's start at the beginning. I was born in Columbus, Ohio. My parents had very different lines of work. My father was an accountant, and my mother was what was called at the time a commercial artist. You would probably call her an illustrator now, did ads for magazines and newspapers. And I hope at least that I sort of inherited some of the sort of different abilities and tendencies that they had. And I grew up in Columbus, and then when I was 5, my family moved to Northeast Dallas. And we lived there for 8 years at the time at the edge of what was a really rapidly growing city, but still it was close enough to the edge of town that I could still ride my bike out to the prairie, and it was out there to be gotten to. Nowadays, not so much. It's still out there. It's just much farther out in Dallas. And then my mother and brother and I moved back to Ohio when I was 13, and I went to junior high and high school there. And then when I was 14, after about 6 or 7 years of becoming a really mediocre trumpet player, I changed instruments and took up the drums, and I've played them ever since. And I assumed when I headed to college that my direction would be one of music performance and then music education later on. Started college in music school as a percussion major, and then at Ohio State in my second year, I took an introduction to folklore course. You're seeing a conversion narrative coming, right? All the markers are pointing you and me in this direction. I think I'd been aware of folklore a little before. I vaguely remember when I was thinking about college, I looked at various catalogs, like you do. This was in the day of hard copy catalogs, and I remember somehow or another coming across the UCLA course catalog, and this was at a time when UCLA, back in the days of sort of National Defense Fund support for studying other cultures and languages, taught a million different languages. I mean, they had a real emphasis there in African languages, particularly, and they had a folklore program, and I think it's probably the first time I knew such a thing existed. My own personal sort of link between the music that I was doing and folklore, I suppose, was probably started with and is somewhat due to the Rolling Stones. When I grew up, I was lucky enough, I suppose, to have been born at a time when I got the full impact of the British invasion of pop music. And in my school, at least, at that time, there was a very strict division, at least among the guys in the school, between the Beatles guys and the Rolling Stones guys. Who did you resonate to? Or who did you resonate to more? I mean, there were a few outliers, a Yardbirds character or two, but it's pretty much Rolling Stones and Beatles. I was a Rolling Stones guy, partly because they had an amazing drummer, Charlie Watts, but also because I became interested listening to them and the songs that they were covering. I mean, in the early years, they were a cover band, and so they sort of pointed me in the direction of some of the blues and rhythm and blues and soul music that they were covering that came from various record companies in important cities in the U.S., notably, but not only Chicago. So I had an interest in those forms of roots in vernacular music. And so when I got to college, took this first folklore course, I guess I was kind of primed to move in this direction. I was especially lucky because I happened to take an introduction to folklore course from a guy who was a great guy and a terrific teacher, Pat Mullen at Ohio State. And there were actually, and so I was hooked pretty early on in that course. And it was an interesting group of people because there were, 3 or 4 other people in that version of that class, fall quarter 1970, who went on to be professional folklorists. Barry Ward, a medievalist and folklorist, who was a grad student at Ohio State at the time, who was working with Francis Lee Utley, the other folklorist on the English department faculty, taught at West Virginia University for his entire career. Charlie Camp, a very close friend of mine who worked at the Smithsonian and then at the Maryland State Arts Council for many years. Jack Shortledge, who's done community folklore work in Ohio and New Jersey and for the Ohio Humanities Council, and me. So it was a good moment. So at that point, the career trajectory that I thought I was going to follow toward music education sort of went by the wayside. Happily, I still get to play music, so that's great. But I suspect I might have made about as good a high school band director as I made a trumpet player, which is good for whole generations of high school students somewhere. I essentially majored in folklore at Ohio State in undergraduate school, comparative lit and anthropology. Went to graduate school in folklore for a while, then sort of returned to Ohio State and started working on folk festivals. You're all aware of what's now called the Festival of American Folklife that the Smithsonian does. Obviously, it's an important event. It's been around for 50 years. It's been a big deal in our field, but I once again feel lucky to have sort of passed through that event at a really important time, and to have had the good fortune to be connected with it at moments that turned out to be quite important. In 1971, when the festival was in its 5th year, I believe it began in 1967, Ohio was the featured state. So at a time when, this was the time when states had money to support things like that, for one thing. But it may have been one of the first states featured at the Smithsonian Festival. I think maybe Mississippi had been before. Texas, there you go. Texas, of course. So that festival program that was on the Mall in Washington was restaged in Ohio for 3 years thereafter. Ohio was featured in the first place because the guy who was governor of Ohio was induced to give the money to help support the event. He liked it when he visited it. His name was John Gilligan. He visited the program in Washington and liked it and decided that it would be reproduced at the state fair. And that was a great thing. It wasn't completely altruistic. He was an urban guy, and in Ohio, if you're the governor, you have to go spend the whole 2 weeks at the state fair, pretty much camping out with the kids with their hogs and dairy cattle. And that was not his thing. But the festival gave him something he liked at the fair to go to. So it was there. So we reproduced the Smithsonian program in 71, and then in 72, 3, and 4, the other 3 years of John Gilligan's term, we did new field work each year to sort of repopulate the festival, and which ran for about 2.5 to 3 weeks at the state fair at the time. Charlie Camp was the director of that event in Ohio and has written some interesting stuff about how the messages of the festival were complicated because where we sat on the state fairgrounds, it was right next to the pavilion that housed the giant rat. And so there were some, communication and education challenges trying to sort of get across the point that we were not the sort of vernacular version of the people we were presenting were not the vernacular version of some, sort of interesting biological spectacle. But that work for the Ohio Folk Festival, which unfortunately came to an end at the end of John Gillian's term when the administration changed and he was voted out of office. That led to me being hired to direct the first statewide folklore festival in Maryland. It's kind of the beginning of the state folklore program in Maryland that then Charlie Camp went on to run for many years. And then to me being hired at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. In 1976, which was the 9th or 10th year of the festival, it was greatly expanded. It was the bicentennial year in the US. Washington was sort of, and Philadelphia were ground zero for that event. And the festival that was produced that year was quite enormous. There were, I think, 7 different festival programs. Family folklore, children's folklore, occupational folklore, regional folklore, an Old Ways in the New World program that brought people, the descendants of immigrants from various places in the Old World and people from the places that they had come from, a Native American program and an African program. I think that was all of them. Each one of those 7 festivals had a completely different program with 100 to 200 different artistic participants each week for 12 weeks. I mean, in essence, it was 80 plus folk festivals, week after week after week, seven at a time for 12 weeks. Preceded by about 2 or 3 years of field work. This was something you couldn't just start working on, a few months in advance. So the Smithsonian hired, the Smithsonian sort of vacuumed up across the country every folklorist they could find that had any sort of experience at all, and probably in some cases none, working on folk festivals. And I was among one of those that got hoovered up into that enterprise. The festivals took place. And then shortly after that, when the festival was done, Bess Hawes, who had been the deputy director of the festival for programming and worked with Ralph Rinsler, the festival director on that, moved from the Smithsonian to the NEA. Became the second director of the NEA Folk Arts program. Alan Jabbour had been there for a while before, and then he went to the American Folklife Center. And Bess had a big idea, a very big idea, which was to populate the country with state folk arts programs. And her way of making that happen was to offer to state arts councils and their directors, relatively significant for the time, pieces of money from the NEA to support the startup of those programs for several years. And the idea that the state would gradually and then at some point eventually take over the funding of that program. And I don't think any state arts council director was reluctant to turn down money from the federal government at that point. I think they saw that a folk arts program could help, that is, state folk arts directors, or state arts council directors, realized that folk arts could help them reach out to all parts of their state, not just the parts of the state where there were mainstream arts organizations, museums, symphony orchestras, and dance companies, and so on. So they took the money and started the programs. Well, who's going to run these programs? Well, luckily enough, there was this big cohort of folklorists, like me, who had just come through 2 or 3 years of experience working on the Smithsonian Folklife Festival in one capacity or another. And so that festival, it didn't set out to do this, but that festival ended up being the training ground for the whole first generation of state folklorists. Peggy Bulger in Florida, Hal Cannon in Utah, George Holt in North Carolina, me in Ohio, Charlie Camp in Maryland, and so on and so on and so on. The list is probably a couple dozen. We're lucky enough to be able to have been sort of in a couple of right places at a couple of right times, and ended up being that first generation of state folklorists.
So just to go back a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
You've made it very easy for me.
No. Glad to help.
Yes. That transition from being a student to having your first professional job.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about how that happened, or?
Yeah. Well, I guess the first professional job I had in the field was working on this folk festival in Ohio. And I can't believe how we did it, honestly. My job was to travel around the state. Luckily, Ohio is a relatively small and densely populated state. To travel around the state of Ohio all summer long, starting about Memorial Day, to identify folk artists, and then to make decisions with other people who are doing the same thing about who was going to be presented at the festival program, to kind of curate that program, and then to put on the thing at the end of August, beginning of September at the State Fair. My recollection was that each of us who did that got $300 for doing it, and no travel money. I have no clue how we did it.
Were you still a student, or were you?
Yeah, I was a grad student at that time at Ohio State, and and it seemed great. 300, sure, happy to. That much, really? So obviously we made it work, and some of us were kind of sharing apartments together, and living in a sort of low impact and certainly low budget way. But I really liked that work. I enjoyed doing the work. I enjoyed obviously I had a connection to Ohio, before that, but I really enjoyed getting to know the state pretty well. It's a very complex place, like any state, but it's small enough at least that the travel time doesn't cut too much into the ethnography time, and can contribute to it. So that part worked really well, and it actually it was sort of on the strength of that I ended up sort of pointed toward public folklore. When I first was hired as the state folklorist in Ohio, at that point I had applied to go to PhD school in folklore, and had some acceptances and some offers of financial aid that I had considered accepting. But after a couple of weeks on the job at the State Arts Council, I realized that this was something that I could get more than $300 per quarter to do. It was maybe as much as $13,000 a year at that point. But that first 2 weeks really reminded me what I had liked about that work all along. That had encouraged me to, like I say, drive all over Ohio for a summer for next to nothing. And so I wrote the places that I had considered going to graduate school in and said, no, I'm going to do this, and did it for 14 years. So I think the transition from student to employment, even at the level I'm talking about, it was relatively easy.
And then you talked a little bit about the 76 festival, the bicentennial. I think it's interesting that there isn't more written in our histories of our field about the influence of the bicentennial. It did seem like it was kind of a key moment. Do you have more thoughts about that festival?
Well, there was a lot going down at that point. Going down in the sense of going up. In our field, and especially the public side of our field. You've got the festival that began as kind of a weekend music performance. I guess I wasn't there in 1967. That within 10 years had grown to this enormous event that was considered to be one of the sort of keystones of the bicentennial commemoration in Washington, which was a big deal. You've got Archie Green and a number of other folklorists working to advocate for what was initially going to be a third national endowment. There already was a national endowment for the arts and a national endowment for the humanities. The idea was there was going to be a national endowment for folk culture. I don't know if it was ever named. It didn't quite get that far. And actually that advocacy campaign, carried out by the brilliant and relentless Archie Green, I guess you could say, sort of frightened, perhaps, the NEA into creating a folk arts program. I mean, part of the reason that the National Endowment for Folk Arts or Folk Culture didn't get created is that Nancy Hanks, who was the chair of the NEA at the time, said, well, yeah, no, we have a folk, we're creating a folk arts program right here, problem solved. So all that was going on, but then Archie's attention was reoriented toward ultimately what became the passage of the American Folklife Preservation Act and the creation through that act of the American Folklife Center. And then you have Bess, making this transition from being a folklore scholar and teaching at Cal State Northridge to coming to Washington to working for the Smithsonian Folklife Festival for a few years, and then transitioning to NEA and having this enormous big idea, without which I cannot imagine where our field in general would be, and certainly the public side of it. So, all these things were happening, in the kind of 1973, 1978 period.
And as one of the first of the cadre of NEA-sponsored public folklorists, is there a way that you'd kind of characterize the personalities of the people and how much of you were sort of inventing your own thing in your own state as opposed to sort of a collective feel? I mean, I know Bess was probably the glue that held you together.
Yeah, well, I mean, she was part of the glue, and other people who worked with her at the endowment, like Bob Teskey and then Dan Sheehy and Barry Burgee, were certainly part of that glue as well, and still are. But the folks who started each of those programs, who were the first directors, were a pretty individualistic bunch, which is where we're headed here in this part of the conversation. What people tended to do as the first thing of these new state folklore programs was to do a sort of statewide survey. In fact, I think there's a session going on, perhaps at this moment, talking about Folklife surveys today here at this meeting. But the idea was, nothing along those lines had been done before, at least not by the state government generally, and so these early state folklorists spent their time traveling around the state, kind of going back to the $300 per summer level, meeting artists, or re-meeting artists they knew already, because generally they were people who those first state folklorists were generally people who had grown up in or were fairly familiar with their states already. It wasn't like they had to figure out, where. I mean, I didn't have to figure out where Cincinnati and Cleveland were in the state. But the thing that sort of distinguished what they did partly had to do with their own inclinations and their own interests in the field. Broadly speaking, there were performing arts people and there were material culture people. And the material culture people and it wasn't a hard division, but it was sort of where your emphases lay and where your priorities lay. But material culture people tended to do statewide surveys that led to exhibitions. Folk arts of Maryland, folk arts of Nebraska, and performing arts people tended to do statewide fieldwork surveys that resulted in folk festivals, which were not exclusively performing arts events, but emphasized it. So there were two sort of models, or two things, sort of paths that people followed, but there was never any, meeting at the National Endowment for the Arts in front of all this where people said, okay, well, so you're the performing arts people, you go do festivals and we'll do exhibitions. People were making it up. I mean, there's certainly no public folklore manual. So there were, each person sort of took on their own version of that template. And the other part of it was, at the time at least, that work was most of what state folklorists did. I mean, arts councils do many things, but fundamentally they're in the business of giving grants. And at least in the early years, there was not so much of that going on within state folk arts programs. It was more sort of doing this kind of baseline research. What's the state of folk culture in Ohio at this, in 1978? And how can we create programs to educate people about it? And then later on, some of the the administrative and grant-giving work of arts councils began to be more of what state folklorists did to try to support communities throughout their state who are already doing folk arts work on their own to do more of it and to do it better.
How many of that early generation, I mean, you were from Ohio, it seemed like a lot of people kind of emerged from the places that they were from. I mean, was that the typical model? And also, what do you think was the balance between academically trained folklorists and people who sort of somehow found themselves as public folklorists?
Yeah.
And how has that changed?
Yeah, well, at the time, to think about this a minute, I guess at the time, I think most of the people who were in this first cohort of state folklorists were people with some academic preparation in the field. But I think they were, I don't know, somewhere in the spectrum of sort of being dissatisfied with the prospect of a straight academic career, or who really liked this other way of being a folklorist. And probably in every person, some of those tendencies were combined. I mean, nobody was at the ends of that spectrum. So I think they were people looking for an alternative. I mean, they liked the field, they liked the work broadly speaking, but they were looking for other kinds of things to do. I mean, they're still educators, just educating different audiences through different means.
In terms of your own identity, as somebody, most of the work that's non-AFS related has either been in Ohio or Washington. Did you ever feel the urge to go to Texas? I mean, your formative years were there.
Yeah. No, oddly enough. I mean, I love Texas, and I still have family there in Brownwood, in the central part of the state. I should say my family left. My mother and brother and I left Texas when I was 13 and returned to Ohio because my parents were divorced. My father remained in Texas, and the part of the family that I have there comes from him. But I didn't. I think my life, this is not just my career, but my life has sort of been an oscillation between, at least it appears that way from this vantage point, between being in Ohio and then being somewhere else, and then being in Ohio and then being somewhere else, and then being in Ohio and being somewhere else.
So Ohio just called you.
Yeah, and so I mean, I love Texas. I'm a little out of touch with it, though I'm in touch with my good friends from elementary school still today. But Ohio is kind of the place where I resonate, and so now I'm in Barbara and I are in somewhere else, and who knows what the next move, if there is a next move, might be.
So tell us a little more about the work that you did initially when you went back and worked for the Arts Council, and then why you left and why you came back.
Sure. Let's see. When I started at the Arts Council, this is sort of contradicting what I said just a minute ago, I suppose, in a way. I was a little, I have a background in performing arts, but I also have an interest in visual arts and material culture. So I was a little on the fence, and the way that about whether to go in the survey leading to exhibition direction or the survey leading to festival direction. The political climate, the larger political climate in Ohio at the time, which was governed at that moment by the administration that had replaced the folklore-friendly Democrat John Gilligan a few years before, was not really amenable to sort of large-scale projects at that point. So what our strategy was to work with community foundations in various cities and other locations in Ohio to get smaller grants from them to do small-scale performing arts or exhibition projects. So the very first project that we did in that program was a fieldwork survey that was done by me and a guy named Nick Berlikoff, who was a folklore grad student at IU, of the Russian communities in Cleveland. And so, of which there are several of different kinds, and that led to an exhibition that was installed and then toured around public library branches in Cleveland, and particularly in the places where where Russian communities live. But then we also received some funding from other local sources to do a performing arts program in a working class Appalachian neighborhood on the west side of Columbus, and to do sort of regional folklore programs leading to festivals in southern Ohio, straight south from Columbus along Route 23, leading down toward central Kentucky, and in western Ohio, the kind of primarily German and Mennonite rural area of Ohio, of western Ohio, next to Indiana. So those were the initial projects we did, and similar kinds of things were going on in other states. I mean, after the statewide survey had been done, and after the folk festival of X state or the folk arts exhibition of X state had been accomplished, what a lot of those programs did as sort of second phase things was to start to do more local kinds of programming, and this was fairly typical. And then not too long after that, and again, I suppose Bess Hawes had at least 3 really, really important big ideas. And the first one was this state folk arts programs to begin with. The second one, and I'm not quite sure the order in which these happened, but I'll say that the second one was the support of apprenticeship activities, both by the federal government, by the NEA, but then encouraging states and encouraging them not just in terms of advocacy, but in terms of funding, to create apprenticeship funding programs within their own states. And Ohio was one of the first states to start such a program, and that became a focus, a sort of second phase or third phase focus of a lot of these state programs. Bess Hawes' third big idea, which might have actually happened second, was the creation of the National Heritage Fellows program, which continues. I mean, it's based on models from other countries, but it's something that's certainly gotten very much its own life here and continues to this day. So the people in these state folklorist positions, I mean, we didn't follow one another in lockstep, partly because in many cases we weren't communicating closely enough to know enough, what we needed to know probably about what others were doing. But these programs tended to sort of take on similar kinds of things at similar times. Partly it was because of funding being made available from the federal level as a result of Bess's many really good and big ideas. But then I would say later in the 70s, early 80s, there began to be more regular meetings of state folklorists. Some of these were put together by NEA and the Folk Arts Program, but the American Folklife Center took a role too. They had, I don't know that they were regular, but probably every couple of years or so there was a gathering of state folk arts coordinators at the Library of Congress to sort of exchange information, and so we began to know more about what one another was up to. That was also about the time when the public program section of AFS was created. I think it was 78 or 79, had its first meeting here. The first session, I mean, there had been public folklore before, as you know. There had been state folklorists before. Going back to, I suppose, Henry Glassey's work in Pennsylvania and George Carey's work in Maryland. But I think that the first session at an AFS annual meeting, and I suppose research could confirm or correct this, was in 1978. 78? Yeah, at the meeting in Salt Lake City. It was a sort of a forum of a bunch of then fairly new state folklorists talking about the stuff that they were up to. And that either just followed or was an impetus toward the creation of the public program section at AFS, which goes strong to this day.
So what led you back away from Ohio and to the nation's capital?
Power, of course. I mean, come on. No, not power. I worked at the Arts Council in Columbus for 14 years as a state folklorist there. generally speaking, times went from really great to less great during that time. And I mean, that had, you know, that kind of judgment has a qualitative background and a quantitative background. But I mean, at one point, you know, in the late 1970s, the Ohio Arts Council had 60 employees. I mean, it was ginormous. I mean, Ohio was, you know, it's a populous and politically important state. You know, support was really strong from the state government, from the federal government. But then times became less good. And by the end of the time that I was at the Arts Council, I was like everybody there. This wasn't me being singled out. You know, staff was much smaller. Everybody was doing double or triple duty. I was helping to run the literature program and in an odd twist for a folklorist, a program that supported the commissioning of avant-garde works of contemporary performing arts, a subject about which I knew nothing when I started, and relatively not so much more by the time I ended, actually. In any case, an opportunity became available at the American Folklife Center, the Library of Congress, to be an assistant director there. It was a position actually that hadn't existed before. And I applied for it in 1990, and then in 1991 I got it, and I moved to Washington and started there. It was an interesting time to be at the Folklife Center because many of its activities at that point were being sort of created out of initiatives that came from the Congress of the U.S. When a new, not so much national park or national recreation area was created, some of them in rural areas like along the New River in central West Virginia, but some of them quite urban like Paterson, New Jersey. There was a stretch of time where every one of those pieces of legislation to create those kind of designate and set aside those places had built into it the stipulation that there be a cultural survey. I mean, essentially like doing a survey of Ohio if you're a brand new state folklorist in 1977. But the idea of doing a cultural survey and doing programming about the distinctive culture of that area. And and a lot of those projects ended up being assigned to a unit of the federal government that was set up to do things like that, the American Folklife Center. And so I'm just cited a couple of those projects. I mean, New River and Paterson, but I don't know, Maggie, there have been a dozen and a half of such projects, something like that over the years?
Was Lowell during that?
Yeah, Lowell had gone on, yeah. So quite a number of these things. Yeah, Pinelands in New Jersey, sure. So it was a really interesting time to be at the Folklife Center because a lot of these things were going on, and it was, you know, it had some resemblances to, you know, the Smithsonian in 1974, 5, and 6. You know, responsibility being handed to the Folklife Center along with funding to do these projects. So, you know, identifying the people who were in a position to do the best field work, you know, assembling a documentary team, figuring out partly inductively and partly deductively, you know, what they were going to pay attention to, and then supervising the field work and the documentation. And then those materials came back into the collection of the center's archive where they are, you know, to this day and forever. So there was a lot of that work going on, so it was an interesting time to be there, and I got to have. I was never the director of any of those projects, which was fine. I'm not complaining, but I got to have some kind of hand in each of them.
Was your position primarily administrative?
There was some part of it that was administrative, and some part of it was just sort of enabling all these projects to happen at the same time, which was partly an administrative thing. You know, the Folklife Center, you know, has always been a part of the Library of Congress, which is a very large and wonderful institution, you know, full of the world experts on any number of things. I mean, subjects as well as, you know, archival and library practice. So it was I mean, it is a large bureaucracy, and getting things done takes time. And in some respects, the library is a completely unique organization, and in some respects, it's like any other bureaucracy of about its size, particularly in a government setting. But it was an interesting challenge to figure out. I mean, not just for me, but for all of us at the Folklife Center, it still is, to figure out how to get good work done under those circumstances. But then, I was there for 4 or 5 years. And, Ohio sang its siren song. Once again, whatever song it sang, I'm listening. Well, I mean, who was actually singing a siren song was at that time was my 6-year-old daughter, who lived with her mom in Columbus. That was an important part of my decision to think about opportunities to go back to Ohio. And I did, to go to work as first as the folklorist, and then a year or so later as the director of a nonprofit in Dayton, Ohio called City Folk, sometimes confused with City Lore in D.C., or in New York City, but they were two very different organizations. City Folk had been started by a group of friends in Dayton about 10 or 15 years before that. It's what in the arts world is called a presenting organization. In other words, it's not a performing ensemble itself, but it presents performances by performing arts groups. And it did that in all kinds of folk and world music and dance, and also had a sort of important subset in jazz. And it was an organization that I knew pretty well because they had been created during the time that I was at the Arts Council. And so the program that I ran was one of the sources that City Folk got pretty regular funding from, because they did really good work. But all this was also festival connected, because at the time when I went to City Folk had, about that time, been selected as the local co-producer with the National Council for the Traditional Arts of the National Folk Festival, the other major folk festival in this country. Not to disrespect anybody I'm forgetting, in 1996, 97, and 98. And so City Folk was kind of it had done performances, and it was really good at doing them, but the National was something much bigger than it had ever done before. So it was a little like the Smithsonian, going from a smaller Festival of American Folklife to a really big one in 1976. So that organization had to gear up. So I came to City Folk essentially to direct that project. And then during the period that the National was there, the director of City Folk, who had been its founder, resigned, and I became the director of the organization for a few years after that.
So you've worked essentially at the state level, the federal level, and the private nonprofit level in public folklore.
Yeah.
How would you characterize some of the differences?
Well, one of the things that hasn't happened much since I came to AFS, and I noticed a lot having just been at City Folk, is the local focus makes an enormous difference. If you're running a local nonprofit, if you're connected like a local nonprofit ought to be with all kinds of communities in your city, the government and the banking community and the educational community and the philanthropic community. Every day when you go to lunch, you walk down the street, you're running into people that you have partnerships with, or that have been on your board, or that you'd like to be on your board, or who don't want to be on your board, or whatever it is. They're all there, and that working in government at the state level and the national level, it just sort of doesn't happen. I mean, you have occasions like this one, where all of us are together under one roof for 3 or 4 days, but it's not an everyday kind of thing. And so that that community connection is really quite important, and doesn't happen in some of those other settings. In some respects, I feel lucky, and it is that. I can assure you it's not by design on my part, because it never would have worked out if I tried to design to do this. I feel as though I've been at the right kind of institution at the right time, or at what, in retrospect turned out to be a good time. Working in state government during a stretch, like I say, it ended, but during a stretch where state government support for the arts and culture for a time was on the rise and was strong. Working at the Smithsonian, certainly earlier on at an interesting time, and then the Folklife Center at a time when quite a number of interesting things were going on, 20 years later. And then being able to be at City Folk at a time when it was, taking on an event that, quadrupled its impact and doubled its budget, and, meant that we needed to go from, a dozen volunteers a year to, I don't know, Julia, what was it, 350 volunteers, or I don't know what it was some very large number. Figuring out how to do that. So every sector of everything sort of ebbs and flows, and I feel like I've had opportunities to work at each of those levels in good and somewhat less good times. But at least, it's possible, of course, to work at all those kinds of places entirely in not good times, and probably not possible to do it all in good times. So I feel like I've been fortunate enough to have good opportunities at each of those places.
You've done a lot of different kinds of fieldwork projects over the
Yeah.
years in these various entities. Is there one that has a special meaning to you, or really had an impact?
Yeah, there is. This has nothing to do with my own personal or family background or ethnicity or identity. My mother's family are sort of Alsatian Mennonites, and my father's family are Welsh. But I worked for a number of years. It was kind of an offshoot of the Cleveland Russian project that I was talking about that was in 77 and 8 and 9 that I worked with Nick Berlikoff on. I got to know through that work and through a friendship with a guy named Walter Mahovlich, who's a Croatian ethnomusicologist and musician from the east side of Cleveland, the sort of southern Slavic communities in Cleveland, Ohio. Croatian and Serbian primarily, but also Bulgarian and Macedonian. Their community, they're large communities, they're politically strong, they're culturally strong. They, in many respects, don't get along particularly well, not just between like Serbians and Croatians who have religious differences that underlie the problems, but even within a particular group, there are factions about newer immigrants and older immigrants and people from different regions and so on. But I found their food and music really compelling, and ended up doing field work there with the Arts Council and with this fellow Walter Mahovlich, who I mentioned, a wonderful musician and ethnomusicologist who's still in Cleveland, though he's committed the cardinal sin of moving from the east side of Cleveland to the west side of Cleveland. Nobody does that, but he did, and he's made it happen. Probably the only guy in Cleveland history who's done that. And with Rick March, who comes from a Southern Slavic background himself and is a fine musician. Rick and Walt and a couple of other people and I did a lot of musical recording in those communities at very sort of informal events. I mean, this is nothing special for folklorists, but we were doing musical recordings of people sitting around a kitchen table, or bands kind of warming up to play at a wedding or at a wedding reception and so on. Vocal music, instrumental music, some of both, ensemble music, solo music, religious music, secular music, from all of those different places. But that recording was done in the early 1980s, but for many years, we were never able to sort of bring it to any sort of public presentation. We weren't able to find the funding to take some selection of that documentary material and make something of it. But finally, I think one of the last things I worked on at the Arts Council in Columbus, we were able to find funding from some community sources in Cleveland, mostly within those communities, to sort of bring the project to some kind of realization through the creation of an LP record. I mean, it's just an LP. There are a million LPs. But for us and for those communities, it was something that we had all worked on for many years and had been disappointed in trying to make public, and sort of to be able to find a way to do that at long last was very satisfying to us, and I believe that for many of the people in the communities we work with, it was important too. Though, it also was not without controversy. I mean, the idea among some parts of the Serbian and Croatian communities in Cleveland that there would be an LP with Serbian and Croatian cuts side by side raised some issues.
You talked a little bit about your academic background, but your path has been perhaps a little
wiggly,
non-traditional. I bet a lot of people don't know you have an MA in design.
That's probably true.
You want to talk a little more about after we know you went to Ohio State and discovered folklore as an undergraduate, but tell us a little more.
Well, yeah, it is. It's kind of wiggly. It was not a straight path, though I suppose I envisioned it would be at one time before this public folklore thing grabbed me or whatever it did. It was pretty various. Because of my interests in music and performing arts, I did a fair amount of coursework along those lines. But I also have always, as I said earlier, have a sort of strong interest in art and material things and material culture. The people I studied with at Ohio State primarily were Pat Mullen, who is a Texas native, grown up, well, actually in many places, but I think he would call Beaumont home. And so through him, I got connected to important folklorists who had taught him, and several of whom were Texan to begin with. I'm thinking about Americo Paredes for one, and Modi Bodwright for another. And also to the work that was going on then. One center of this work at Texas was through Roger Abrams and Dick Bauman, who were doing interesting things in the late 1960s and early 70s when I was in undergraduate school. I also had the great fortune to study with Francis Lee Utley. Turned out to be right at the end of his life, because he died relatively young. For those of you who don't know Fran Utley, he's from Wisconsin originally, I think born in the teens of the last century. BA, MA, PhD, I think BA at University of Wisconsin, but then he went to Harvard for graduate school in the English department. He was a medievalist for the most part, and a student of the Bible as literature. But he studied with George Lyman Kittredge, who was the second person to be a folklorist in the English department at Harvard following Francis James Child, who actually was the first professor of English at Harvard and actually became professor of English before there was an English department, but that's another story. Anyway, so Fran Utley was an old school guy. The classic piece of work that you had to do for a Fran Utley course on the folktale was to make a poster of the sort of like 5 or 6 variations on a given folktale type, and to be able to sort of analyze the similarities and differences in the places where one version would take a sharp left turn, where the other would take a sort of slow curve to the right. Fran Utley, was a text-based guy. He was quite important in the American Folklore Society. He was our president in, I think, 1950 and 51. I was able to take courses in the folktale and in the Bible as literature from him, which were 2 things pretty much over the center of his scholarly plate, and was lucky enough to be his teaching assistant at for the quarter that turned out to be the last quarter he taught at Ohio State. He retired, went to UNC as a visiting professor, and then within a couple months after that, I passed away. Then when I started graduate school in folklore at UCLA. And I think probably what I should have done at that point is not go on to school. I needed to do something other than go to school, but it was the only thing that I thought I knew how to do. So I did. Some of you may have had this experience yourselves at one time or another. D.K. Wilgus, who was the chair of the folklore program at that time, was good enough to get me a job that actually provided the additional bit of financial support that sort of made it possible for me to go. But I took some great courses from people who were there. I took the Introduction to Folklore Studies graduate course from Waylon Hand, and oddly enough, he had me do exactly the same kind of thing I'd done for Fran Utley, so I was good to go in that class. Versions of a folktale on a poster showing that I'm there. I am there. So that, I could devote a little more of my attention to some of the other classes. But my job at UCLA, DK had been at Western Kentucky, as you know, before that, and he had brought with him to UCLA a Western Kentucky folk belief collection, which was a series of...
better.
Yes, yeah, well, right. Yeah, there may be some IP issues here that Michael Ann would like to speak about, but it was a series of 3x5 index cards, and each one had a folk belief on it. There were, I don't know, thousands, tens of thousands. I don't know. It seemed like an enormous number. One of the reasons that it seems like an enormous number was that my job, and I'm, it sounds like I'm disrespecting DK, and I'm not. I appreciate him doing this because it did make it possible for me to go there. But my job was to sit in a room. It was Bob George's faculty office because he was on leave then, and with a big stack of index cards from this archives and a rubber stamp and a stamp pad, and to stamp in the lower right-hand corner of each card, D.K. Wilgus, Western Kentucky Folk Belief Archive, University of California, Los Angeles. Well, I was exposed to quite a number of folk beliefs, though I will say I've never really taken that up as as a scholarly interest. It's the kind of work that's got to be done. Come on, we all know this, but I think it contributed at that point to my thinking, why am I here? Which I probably, I shouldn't have. I mean, it was Los Angeles, from the Midwest, West LA, Westwood. It's a great place. So oddly enough, at that point, maybe not oddly enough, because this is the same old story, over again. I had taken a course in undergraduate school at Ohio State in design. Essentially, it was the history of design as a subset of the history of art. The history of visual communication, graphics, posters, book covers, you name it, and the history of design of objects. And I was, like I said, I had some inclinations in that area originally. Maybe it connects to the fact that my mom was an illustrator and sort of produced some of these kinds of things. But I was offered an opportunity to come back to Ohio. Here we go again. To take to do master's degree work in design, essentially design history at OSU. Once again, it was more going to school. I mean, it wasn't radically different in that respect, but at least there was, it did not appear to have this dimension to it. So I did it, and it was really quite a good 2 years. It was just something that I was interested in a general way, wasn't interested in a career in, and it seemed like a break, and I was able to play drums enough to pay my way through school on my own. So it made for some long days, but it worked out pretty well. Then when I went to Washington to work at the American Folklore Center, I was getting up in years, though that age seems relatively young now, and wanted, I figured, I had always been interested in getting a doctoral degree in the field. I had some interest in teaching, and part of it was I'd sort of fallen short of doing it so many times, it just kind of pissed me off. And I wanted to get it done. That would not have been possible within the folklore program at the English department at Ohio State, because it was pretty much set up for 8 to 5 Monday through Friday classwork. And I was working that stretch was when I was working at the Arts Council. It just wasn't feasible to take 3 or 4 afternoons off and go to school and keep my job. But when I moved to Washington, the American Studies program at George Washington University, in which the folklorist was John Vlatch, student of Henry Glassey's, who'd gotten his degree at Indiana. John was the folklorist in that program, and as it happened, was the chair of the program at the time. And the great thing, certainly lucky for me about that program, was that it was set up. Most of the people, graduate students in the program, were people who were working in D.C. They were at the Library of Congress in some division or another. They were at one of the Smithsonian museums. They were at the National Archives. They were there for work reasons. And so the American Studies program at GW was set up with late afternoon seminars, a lot of independent study. I mean, it was perfect for people who were not in a position to do a sort of standard, kind of graduate school routine. So I got into that program, did coursework in the primary coursework, and at GW you take coursework in American Studies. You take coursework in 4 areas, and those lead you toward exams, and then you do your dissertation after that. Mine were American folklore, 19th century American literature, American cultural history, which is the one area that everybody has to do in that program, and then you have to select a culture area outside the U.S. for your 4th. So it's an American Studies degree, but it can't be all inside our borders. So what I chose was African art and culture. Once again, a material culture thing. And John is a wonderful folk architecture scholar, material culture scholar, and teacher. He is able, completely amazed me. Maybe this is more widespread than I know, because my academic background was so sort of patched together. But of anybody I've ever taught with, he was a guy who was capable of coming in and giving a 2-hour lecture that had a complete arc to it, where one sentence sort of led definitely to the next. Examples were brought in at different times, and a talk that would take you from, being curious but uninformed about something to being relatively well informed and even more curious at the end. He was really quite a good teacher, and I feel lucky to have had good teachers along the way. So I did that work. I wrote my dissertation. It was actually a kind of social history of the National Folk Festival, and finally got done at age 49.
Since you did write your dissertation on the National Folk Festival, an interest we both
Yeah,
share,
yeah.
But you also had the opportunity to work, several opportunities to work for the National Folk Festival.
Yeah.
Do you have any insights to what you think the influence of the National was, as opposed to the Smithsonian or even Newport?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've talked about the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. To be honest, I haven't thought about the Newport Folk Festival, and so I can't comment on too much. The National Folk Festival, I think, it's had, well, I mean, I can ask you some questions about this too, because Michael Ann has written a book on this topic, and an excellent book it is. The National Folk Festival has had a sort of very interesting and important effect on the U.S. in its more recent phase, since early 90s. When did it start moving around the country, Julia? 91, 92? 83. Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah, sure. Before the New York one in '86, right. In the early 1980s, the National Folk Festival, which had been at Wolf Trap for quite a number of years, began to do sort of what it had done in its earlier years, which was take place in different places in the United States. In its earlier years, the National Folk Festival, which was created by Sarah Gertrude Knott, a very interesting person about whom you should ask Michael Lamb, because she wrote the book. In its early years, it began, oh boy, I should remember this, 1934? Yeah, moved around more or less every year to a new city in the United States. And it was a stage presentation on a sort of the proscenium stage in the big downtown, memorial kind of auditorium. But then it entered a kind of middle period where it was at Wolf Trap for 12 years, yeah. Wolf Trap Farm Park for the Performing Arts in the Virginia suburbs outside DC. But then in the early 80s, the leadership of the National Council for the Traditional Arts, including Joe Wilson, who was its director, made a decision to move in a sort of third direction that had some similarities to its first, which was that the festival, NCTA would take the festival to a new community in the United States every 3 years and use that 3 years as a way to sort of, produce the event with local partners so that the program would have a combination of sort of performers from the NCTA universe, which is a very big and diverse universe, and also people from the locality and state and region where the festival is being staged. But those 3 years would also build up local capability so that after 3 years, the local co-sponsoring organization, which was critical to doing this kind of thing, could carry on some sort of event afterwards. So it was a sort of Johnny Appleseed theory, that you would travel the country dropping these apple seeds, which would then bear local fruit. And for the most part, it's been the way it's worked out. So in that, well, what's it been now, 34 years since that started happening, I mean, a number of important local events, many of which continue, have been sort of created by the National and by NCTA that part of the history of our field is somewhat less well known. I'm not quite sure why that is. It should not be. But I mean, the other interesting, or one of the other interesting impacts of the National Folk Festival is actually one that didn't happen, which you know about. I should honestly ask you to tell the story, but I'll tell it, and Michael Ann will correct me because I'm sure I don't know. I don't have all the facts straight. There was a time in the 1930s when Sarah Gertrude Knott, the founder of the National Folk Festival, spoke with officials at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville about the possibility of creating sort of a home for the National and the National Folk Festival Association, which is what's now NCTA was called at the time, that would be associated with a new academic program in folklore. And my take on that is she may not have known it, but essentially what she was proposing, what would have been the first folklore graduate program in the United States, centered around a public folklore presentation. Think about what the impact would have been. I mean, you have to imagine it because we don't exactly know how it would have worked out, but I can imagine that the impact on our field, if our first academic program had an indissoluble link to a major public folklore presentation, the history of our field from then on, and particularly some of the conflicts, which I believe to have pretty well passed away between the academic and public sectors of our field, might have been quite different. Is that more or less the deal? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's this one thing that did happen that's quite recent, and these are just two things I'm singling out. This is a wonderful event that clearly has been going on now, for more than 80 years and deserves a lot of attention. But I think just as important as the thing that didn't happen is for us to imagine what would have happened if the thing that didn't happen did.
Well, we're turning to you, and one last question just before we take a short break so that you all can ask questions, and then we are going to turn to Tim Lloyd as in his involvement with AFS,
No.
but you've touched a little bit on this along the way. But what individuals would you signal out, either academically or public, as your mentors, and why?
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I have mentioned them, so I'm going to more or less be repeating names that I've said already. Who are the people without whom I, wouldn't have gotten to do what I've done or wouldn't be here? In the field of folklore, certainly Pat Mullen, Fran Utley, Dan Barnes at Ohio State, D.K. Wilgus at UCLA in the 1970s, then John Vlach at George Washington later on. On the public side of the field, Ralph Renzler, the founding director of the Smithsonian's Folklife Festival, Bess Hawes, for reasons that I hope I've made clear. Bob Byington, a guy who is not much remembered, I sense, in our field, and ought to be. Ralph Renzler, during those peak years in the middle 1970s, Ralph Renzler was the director of the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. But there were two deputy directors. There's a deputy director for programs, who was Bess Hawes, and a deputy director for operations, who was Bob Byington. Bob was a Penn-trained folklorist? Yeah, that's what I thought. Who taught at Point Park College in Pittsburgh for a time, was very active. Go hear Diane Goldstein's paper and you'll hear about it, I think, in the movement within AFS toward creating a more robust presence for applied folklore. Not so much public folklore, but applied folklore within AFS. And then worked at the Smithsonian during those critical years, and was a major liaison between the Smithsonian Folklife Festival and the academic folklore community around the country, and traveled the country to sort of build up, to fish for potential folklore staff and to build up enthusiasm for this big Smithsonian Folklife Festival. And then he, after that time, he taught English at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington for the rest of his career. He's passed away now. So not just Ralph, not just Bess, but Bob Byington. Alan Jabbour, with whom I had the opportunity to work. Phyllis Brzezowska, who founded City Folk and from whom I learned a lot. The nonprofit in Dayton that I directed. And I'm sure I'm forgetting people. And a couple of people outside the field, most notably a guy named John Reinfrank, an industrial designer who was one of the guys that I studied with at Ohio State, who unfortunately now has passed away also.
So let's just take a little chance to, if there are questions that you all would like to ask of Tim, we will be focusing in the second half specifically on his role with the American Folklore Society, but from what we've talked about so far, are there questions that any of you all would like to ask?
Yeah, Jim. Yes. It's wired, so you come on up.
So Tim, I think the first time I saw your name was your article in Western Folklore on Cincinnati chili. So can you explain kind of the genesis of that?
Wow. Yes, it started because I love this stuff, but that love has grown cold. I must confess. One of the best things about being the state folklorist in Ohio in the late 1970s was that, as one dimension of those good times that I mentioned earlier, they got sort of good, sort of strong financial times, and in state government and at that agency in particular, there was a fair amount of money for travel. Later on, that pretty well went away. And so I had the opportunity to do more of what I had done a few years earlier, working for the Ohio Folk Festival during the summer, drive around the state and get to know people and places. Actually, I had a number of friends at the time who lived in Cincinnati, and so I spent time there for personal and professional reasons. And it's hard to spend time in Cincinnati without coming across Cincinnati chili. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's a sort of meat chili that has, in addition to the standard kinds of things that most chili has in it, the recipes vary, right, because it's traditional. But essentially, it also has things like allspice and cinnamon in it. It is a food that was developed by in the teens of the last century by Greeks and Macedonians who were running food stalls and food carts, and then later on restaurants in Cincinnati. It actually is very much like a number of other food traditions around the country, like hot Texas wieners in Paterson, New Jersey, where the sauce is quite the same, and also it essentially comes from Greek culinary tradition. In any case, I spent enough time in Cincinnati not just to eat the chili a lot. I should say also it's served, generally speaking, it's served on spaghetti. And in Cincinnati, when you order Cincinnati chili, you order it a certain way. There's a two-way, a three-way, a four-way. Spaghetti and chili is a two-way. Spaghetti, chili, and cheese is a three-way. Spaghetti, chili, and cheese, onions is a four-way. Spaghetti, chili, cheese, onions, and beans is a five-way. And there are places that go like 11 ways, but let's not go that far today. In any case, it became pretty clear, not just that there was a lot of chili to be had in Cincinnati, but that people in Cincinnati spent an enormous amount of time not just eating it, but talking about it, sharing stories or arguments about which place was better, or which place was on the way up or the way down, or who had left which restaurant and had he actually gotten the secret recipe, because of course the spice recipes are always secret, completely alike to one another, but always very separate and secret. So the interesting, it's not just food, it's foodways. The thing that got me interested was the amount of time and the amount of attention that people in Cincinnati paid to this thing, and to, in fact, cooking it at home when there's no difficulty whatsoever in Cincinnati. You don't have to walk farther than 100 yards in most neighborhoods of Cincinnati to be able to buy chili somewhere. So I did research both with the restaurateurs who sold the stuff. It's mostly small local chains, and they're sort of individual mom and pop places. Though in the years since then, the chains have sort of consolidated a bit, and also talked with sort of home cooks about their recipes to try to sort out. It was a little bit like doing the folktale thing for Fran Utley and Waylon Hand. What the core recipe was, what the core narrative was, and then what the variations were that different people added into the recipe or took from it, and that led to a paper that was actually, I read it at the AFS meeting in LA in 1979, and then there were actually several sessions at that meeting on foodways, and Mike Jones, who among other things is a foodways scholar, I believe he was the editor of Western Folklore at the time, and pulled together a bunch of those papers into more publishable form, working with all of us authors, and it came out as a special issue of Western Folklore, I think in 80 or 81, and then have been sort of repurposed into book form since then. But it was. I suppose it's sort of a classic folklore studies example of being entranced initially by the stuff. Whether you're hearing a kind of music you haven't had before, or eating a kind of chili you hadn't eaten before, and believe me, with a Texas background, Cincinnati chili seemed like something completely alien. But then discovering, sort of stumbling into some sense of what the significance of this tradition was to people there, and then sort of essentially following up on it by doing interviews over a period of a year or so about all of the dimensions in which chili is important in Cincinnati, to sort of neighborhood identity and to I mean neighborhood identity within Cincinnati, but also Cincinnati identity, as opposed to the rest of the world where this, who haven't had the opportunity to sample this ambrosial stuff.
Did you ever feel like it was like a burden to be the Cincinnati chili guy?
Well,
before you became the executive director of Bess?
well, it's funny that article. And another article that my friend Charlie Camp and I wrote that was published in Kentucky Folklore Record, I think, called 6 Reasons Not to Produce Folklife Festivals, which would seem an odd thing coming from people who had made their career doing this. Because Charlie Camp was, like me, he was the director of the Ohio Folk Festival that I worked on. We had been in that class of Pat Mullins together. He then went to Maryland. He was essentially the first really full-time state folklorist in Maryland, though George Carey had done that before. So he were he telling his story, it would line up with mine. Sorry, where was I going with this?
Those are the things you were known for.
Oh yeah. We wrote this paper, 6 Reasons Not to Produce Folklife Festivals, and I keep hearing from people about it. And there was a while where I thought, for God's sake, I've done other things. It's just this paper, it's just chilly. Essentially, we were, the folk festival paper. I mean, we designed the title to get attention, and man, did it. Essentially, what we were doing was putting forth some of the reasons that many people who produce folklife festivals, ourselves included, had advanced for doing them. And saying, well, these reasons are, we're not saying they're wrong, we're not saying they're unjustifiable, but examining them, would improve our practice, thinking about them a bit. But, the rep of the thing was, wow, these guys worked at this festival, I hate festivals. So for a long time, I remember thinking, I have done other things. But then now, now I've got to the point, maybe it's just age or mellowing or I don't know what, but it's like, great, I wrote that thing 40 years ago and people keep talking about it. Thank you, Jim. So that's, that's good. I'm happy to be the Cincinnati chili guy.
Are there other questions of the sort of pre-AFS Tim Lloyd that anyone wants to ask? We will have opportunity at the end as well to ask questions, so if you want to hold them till then.
Well, I would like to ask a question following up a little bit
Yep.
With the mentoring question and a little bit with the chili, is because working with a lot with public folklore, who would you say, can you tell us a little bit about the peers you worked with, kind of like Charlie Camp and folks that were also instrumental or pivotal in yours and their career?
Sure. Well, I think, certainly at the top of that list would have to be Charlie. This is a guy I've known, like I said, since 1970. We were, in our teens when we met. Has had quite a long history of doing really good work on festivals. Excellent scholarship on foodways. His doctoral dissertation, which was from Penn, was a study of a WPA-era project called America Eats. It was a series of sort of regional ethnographic kind of vignettes of food and food events around the United States that the WPA commissioned, but it was relatively late in the New Deal period. And when World War II came, the WPA kind of shut down relatively quickly because the nation's attention, immediately turned elsewhere. So it was a project that came along a little bit too late in the WPA era to ever be published. Never got done. So Charlie was a sort of foodways student and material culture folk life student of Don Yoder's significantly at Penn, and followed up on that project, got to its archival records and the manuscripts that had been created by all of these writers and scholars around the country, and did a really nice study of it, and has sort of published a series of excerpts from that to begin with. But I had the opportunity to work with Charlie on a number of different regional projects in Maryland. After a couple of years. This goes back to what I was saying before of statewide folklore festivals in Maryland, which was the tack that was taken there. Charlie began to do a series of smaller scale exhibitions and regional folklife festivals, sort of following that pattern I was citing earlier of going from the first thing you do to, to focus on the state as a whole to more focused programs that have to do with particular regions or communities or traditions. And well, I've already mentioned several, Bess, Bob Byington. It's certainly appropriate to call Joe Wilson's name in all of this. I can't remember when I met Joe, but it was a very long time ago. He and I worked together on several, a number of national folk festivals, both the ones in Dayton that I talked about earlier, but earlier ones that were the first place that the festival went to when it went back out on the road from Wolf Trap was the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area between Cleveland and Akron in northeastern Ohio. And Joe and I had worked on some other events at that site, at that National Park Service site, some of them, in fact, featuring the Serbian, Croatian, Macedonian, and Bulgarian communities in Cleveland that I was talking about earlier. For those of us, I guess, talking about the significance of the National Folk Festival earlier, a great many key folklorists from the public side of the field have had a hand in that festival, one kind or another over the years. Have served on the board of NCTA. I was on the board myself for a while. I think working with Joe on all of those activities and with Julia and other people from the NCTA staff has been a great influence on all of us. I mean, Joe's sort of dogged, aggressive, and damn effective advocacy skills. I believe I've learned a lot from. I'm not Joe and I can't do Joe, but I try to be Joe as much as I can be Joe in those regards. An enormously creative and articulate and effective guy at getting things done.
So let's start talking about AFS.
Okay.
What was the first AFS meeting you went to, and what did you think of it?
1874. It was in Dodge City, and we brought weapons. And we the first AFS meeting I went to was 1972. I was a senior at Ohio State. Meeting was in Austin. We all stayed at a motel, the kind where the cars parked right out front, and there's a series of doors, and you walk along. It was not at a hotel like this. You had to go outside whenever you went from one room to the other. It was in Austin, which was an interesting. A lot of interesting things in folklore scholarship were going on in Austin at that time, and Austin was a node for that. I loved it. I suppose everybody else at their first AFS meeting, I was probably 90% at sea, trying to sort of figure out what was going on. Luckily, the people who I was studying with at the time, Pat Mullen and Fran Utley, were there, and they were, Fran was a senior guy in the field at that point, and Pat younger, but they were good enough to introduce me to a lot of people. But it's this sort of, I had a stargazing opportunity. So Richard Dorson, Kenny Goldstein, talking. They're real. That experience isn't unique to me. But 72 was the first one, and I've been to every one since then except for 74, 84, and 94. I don't know what it was about the 4 years that I missed, but those.
And then tell us how you mentioned, in fact, a little bit earlier about your first position within AFS.
Yeah.
Again, connected to Charlie Mayo.
Yeah. Well, from 1888 to 2000, AFS never.
1888?
Well, not me. No. I'm old, but not that old. From 1888 to 2000, AFS did not have full-time staff, ever, as far as I know. AFS was managed by a series of the name changed a little bit from time to time, but executive secretaries or executive secretary treasurers. Sometimes secretary and treasurer jobs were separated and two different people did them. More often they were together. The very first one was William Wells Newell, who was the guy that, I think it's fair to say, created the society, brought together the humanities faculty, although even they wouldn't have been called that at the time, the faculty in newly developing mostly English departments at universities, the museum and university-based anthropologists, and the private citizens that were the three groups that constituted AFS at the beginning. The example I usually use when I talk about them is, Francis James Child on the academic side, Franz Boas on the anthropology side, and Mark Twain. All three of them were among the initial members of AFS from academic anthropology and members of the public groups. So a number of people did that job along the years. When William Wells Newell did it for 17 or 18 years. McEdward Leach out of Penn did it for about that length of time. Diane's dad, Kenny Goldstein, did it for quite a long time. Then from 1981 to 86, my friend Charlie Camp, working at the Maryland Arts Council at the time, was the secretary-treasurer of AFS. And because I knew AFS and I knew Charlie well, I got to know the work that he was doing. And at that time, secretary-treasurer terms ran for 5 years. And the general understanding was you did it for once and then you didn't. So I think before Charlie was David Hufford, and then before Dave Hufford was Dick Bauman, and I think before Dick it was Kenny, I believe. Anyway. So Charlie's term came to an end. I don't remember if we had conversations about it, but I thought it would be an interesting work to do, and so I applied. And was offered the job and was secretary-treasurer from 86 to 91 when my term ended. Then it passed to Shalom Staub, who did it for longer, and then I became the director. But I think for the record, it's important to note that I was not the board's first choice to be executive secretary of AFS in 1986. In fact, I was not even the board's second choice. But the people who were selected before me didn't want to do it, so I got to do it. So I'm thankful I was at least somewhere on the list and did get the opportunity to do it. It was very different then because from the late 70s to the very early 2000s, a lot of AFS's business was handled for us by the American Anthropological Association. In the late 70s, I think it was probably Dick Bauman, I believe, at least that's the story I've heard, realized that AFS had grown to the point that it would be impossible for a single part-time person to do all the work that needed to be done to attend not just to the society's basic business, but to the publication of the journal and the management of the membership database, although I'm sure it was on cards at that point, a database, over the time, doing the annual meeting and so on. So we contracted with the American Anthropological Association, a learned society and professional association like AFS, but much, much bigger. Probably a power of 10 bigger than us, with offices and staff in DC to do that work for us. So they kept our books, did our financial record keeping. They arranged for the publication of our journal, just like they arranged for the publication of AAA's various journals. They had a meeting staff who organized our annual meeting. And so that left the secretary-treasurer of AFS to do other kinds of work. It was a good thing that those bases were covered because during my stretch as secretary-treasurer came the society's centennial, where once again it was sort of an occasion where the place I was working for decided to do this great big thing, unlike what they had done before. And AFS was created in 1888. Its actual birthday is January 4th. And the Journal of American Folklore started coming out in 1888, but the first annual meeting was and AFS was created in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Then the next year in 1889, the Society's first annual meeting was held in Philadelphia. So when we had the centennial celebration, not content to have 1 year of huge stuff going on, we decided to have 2. So the Society's centennial was focused on the 1888 and 89 years and on the annual meetings that were once again scheduled in Cambridge in 1988 in Philadelphia in 1989. So There was a large Centennial Coordinating Committee headed by Roger Abrams and with a dozen or so leaders in the field taking part in it. Funds were raised from the Skaggs Foundation, which was then in Oakland, California, and the Pew Charitable Trust in Philadelphia to support activities that were going on then. Actually, some of the Pew money led to the creation of the Philadelphia Folklore Project. I mean, a well-known public folklore organization now that was initially an AFS program for the centennial year in '89, and it was always intended that the PFP would leave the nest, I suppose you could say, and go off and grow on its own. And under Deborah Kodish's leadership, and then Selena Morales' more recently, it's done that. So this last hour has made me realize that I've sort of ended up being in jobs in places where some big thing was coming up. So it was certainly a good experience all around.
And then you want to tell us a little bit about how the position of the executive director as a full-time.
Yeah, well, like I say, we had this relationship with AAA, but then when I became the director of AFS, I'll tell you just a few sentences about my first day on the job. Our offices were at the Mershon Center on the Ohio State campus in Columbus. It's the Mershon Center for International Security Studies, which means that the building is populated with former military guys, CIA, National Security Agency people, political scientists, military historians, economists, and the American Folklore Society. First day on the job, January 2001. I hadn't yet driven to Harrisburg to pick up the files from Shalom Staub, who had been Secretary-Treasurer before. So I walked into my office and I had a computer, and I had a phone, and I had a pencil. And I was just sort of sitting there and thinking, well, should I turn it on? Or I was really quite at sea about what I was supposed to do. But then, things changed. Work came my way. I picked up the files, and there was, of course, an enormous amount to do. After a couple of years on the job, it became pretty clear to me and to the board of AFS that we needed to step away from that relationship with AAA. It was not because of any problem with the services they were providing us. The people who work at the AAA, the accounting people are really good accountants, and the meeting planning people are really good meeting planners. But they were based in DC. We're paying a lot of money to them to do that because DC salaries are high because they need to be. DC overhead is high. We're essentially helping to pay, a portion of AAA's building rent and so on. And we were running deficits that almost exactly corresponded to the amount of money that we were paying into AAA overhead. And so we decided it was time for us to start sailing our own ship. And over a period of about a year and a half, we stepped away from that relationship with AAA. We didn't take all of that work that they had done on ourselves. We contracted out our accounting to an outside accounting firm. We use a different one now that we're in Indiana, but the same thing applies. We put out a request for proposals for the publication of Journal of American Folklore. A bunch of university presses applied. We chose Indiana, Illinois, and it's still published for us by the Illinois Press. But we took on all of our membership record keeping, and we took on the production of the annual meeting. And the reaction of members at the time to that was really interesting because, I'm sure there were contrary views, and I'm sure we probably even heard about some of them, but my main recollection is people within AFS saying, thank God you've gotten us out from under the heel of the anthropologists, which we weren't. Like I say, the people who were doing our work were professionals in their own line of work, meeting planning, accounting, database management, whatever. But it seemed to feel good. I think it did feel good, to our identity as a field that we were on, on our own now. Way back in the 20th century, there was a stretch in the middle period of the century where AFS would actually hold its annual meetings in alternate years along with AAA and the Modern Language Association. So we'd be with AAA one year, with MLA the next, and then back. But then we began having our own meetings in the 50s, and this felt, I guess, to some people as though this was an additional move in a really good direction to establish folklore as a field. You know, it may not be a big boat, but it's our boat. And I think it worked out really well. I mean, with the exception of I mean, just in a quantitative way, with the exception of 2008, which was a horrible financial year for the world, you know, we haven't run a deficit since. But I think that's great. I mean, certainly, you know, I have no problem with that. But I think the main benefit of it was it was a pride moment for our field that had sort of resonated forward for a number of years since. So I think we did the right thing for a number of reasons, including some we really didn't anticipate at the time.
What particular skills do you think that you personally brought to the position?
I think a lot of it had to do with fundraising. I mean, AFS has been pretty active in doing a number of projects, you know, archival and scholarly communications projects, international projects, projects to provide professional development support for people in our membership. And all of that's been made possible by outside funders. And I think the thing that has helped me be good at raising funds is 14 years of reviewing applications at the Ohio Arts Council. I mean, a major part of what I did from pretty early on was provide funding support to organizations. That's not unusual for state folklorists. People, Steve, you work on that all the time, as you know. You know, I probably, during that time when I was at OAC, I probably reviewed 10,000 grant applications. And, you know, that's not a bad way to learn how to write them. I mean, it's not exactly the same. You don't magically start writing them that way. You have to have practice at that. But I think it really helped a lot to know, you know, how that you have to tell a story and you have to be clear about it at the beginning, and you know, that helps. And then, secondly, well, you know, if you're good at it, you might get the money. And if you get the money, then you have to do the project, which is where the really hard work starts. But once again, like I've said, I've had the good fortune to work at a number of places at times when they were taking on something way bigger than they'd ever done before, and having had the responsibility for figuring out how in the heck we were going to do that thing. Not by myself, but most often with a whole team of other people. But that experience helps on the, once you get the grant. So I think those two things have helped a lot. And I think one of the things it's good to know is how to work with a board. Like I said, when I was at City Folk in Dayton, I'd run into board members or past board members or potential board members all the time. Walking down the street or getting a slice of pizza, across from our office. The AFS board is different. Perfectly good people, perfectly committed to the field. They do great work, but the board is from all over the country. Board meets twice a year for a total of, depending upon the year, 4 or 3 days for a whole year. 2 days once, and either 1 or 2 days. 2 days in the spring, and either 1 or 2 days at this meeting in the fall. And so you don't have the same kind of sort of common identity and understanding necessarily that you have in a local nonprofit board where it meets on the 3rd Thursday of every month. And everybody's running into everybody else standing in line for a slice of pizza. So there's all kinds of communication opportunities that go on day after day after day in that setting. They're very different on a national level. So, and board members only serve for 3 years, which, I mean, you tell me, but my guess is, it seems like forever when you start, and then it goes like that.
Yeah.
So getting a board that's constructed on that basis, I mean, what I've said has nothing to do with the people who are involved, just the structure of the thing. Getting people involved in a way that will bring them up to speed really fast and be productive on questions that are, sometimes they're simple and sometimes they're really, really complicated and it can't be solved by AFS alone. They require, people from all the way across the field to get involved. Is a good skill to have.
What would you say is the contribution to AFS that you're most proud of?
I guess it is creating the understanding, and I hope I have. I guess I should ask you rather than just assume that this is what you think. Creating the understanding that creating an understanding of how important it is to have professionalized our society. Professionalize the management and the running of it. I think that when the board in the late 90s, as a result of a long-range planning process, figured out that for AFS to go where they wanted it to go, even though I think they weren't entirely sure where they wanted it to go, they knew they wanted to have a more active and engaged AFS, and they realized they need to have full-time staff to do it. So they believed, and then I believed, but I think well, if Bill Ivey were here, and he was, but he left, he would say, as I've heard him say many times before, and I believe it, folklore is a primary humanities discipline. Let's set aside public folklore for a second. You've got study of literature, the study of art, study of history, study of philosophy, and the study of traditional culture. He has argued, I would agree with that argument, that folklore is a primary humanities discipline in the same way as those others. That's not to say that there's a folklore department at every university like there is an English department or a history department. Whether that will ever happen, I do not know. But I think it's important. Our field has had some difficulty from time to time in coping with success. We are for the vernacular side of culture and life, and we're for the little guy and the little woman. We stand with them. We say we give them voice, or we help them, find a channel for their voice or whatever it is. And as a result, we have been often reluctant to play in a big and complicated world. But for our field to be taken seriously in the world, we have to do that. And so I would hope that the things that I've done would make clear the fact that we can be effective in those bigger worlds, but not give away what makes us who we are as folklorists.
I have lots more questions, but the time has just flown. So
wow. We're over.
You're probably one of the best known people in American folklore right now. Why don't you tell us one thing that people do not know about Tim Lloyd?
Well, let's see. You already know I play the drums. I've got it. I wrote a line in a Dr. Seuss book. Thank you for coming. No, sort of. Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel has long passed away, but there's a Dr. Seuss industry that survived him, and they produce essentially books that are, they're not the wacky kind of surreal out there Dr. Seuss books about like On Beyond Zebra and letters that are wild and don't exist maybe, but they do more straight educational books for kids to learn about different. This particular book they did was Hooray for Holidays. It's the Cat in the Hat educational series. Hooray for Holidays, and it was sort of little bits, with the Cat in the Hat kind of leading the reader along the way to understand different holidays, both from the United States and other places, and from various religious traditions. It's a kind of multicultural education book. And they found out about AFS and they found out about me, and they said, "Would you look? Can we send you the manuscript and would you look at it to tell us if you think we've made cultural errors that need to get fixed before this thing goes out?" And I said, "Sure." So they sent to me, and then one of the pages, I can't remember the text, and I should try to remember it or find it. There was one text, one page on the text where it was in the early part of the book, and they had written some things about holidays in general, and it was like, it wasn't wrong, but it wasn't quite right, and the rhyme was kind of weird. This didn't scan right. And this is Dr. Seuss stuff, right? It's in his name and his legacy. It's got to, it has to live as poetry. So I said, the book is fine. I think there were a couple of things that maybe needed to get fixed at a small scale, but I said, I think this is not really right, and I'll take the liberty of telling you, here's a replacement text for these lines. You're welcome to use it if you want. Never heard back from him, and then a year later, he sent me a copy of the book, and there they were. So I wrote 2 lines in sort of a Dr. Seuss book, and hopefully, and hopefully so doing, fulfilled a good public folklore responsibility about teaching young kids across the country, the value of understanding other cultures. So there.
Is there any one burning question before we wrap this up? Dr. Farrell.
That's a great example of the many things you've done as AFS Executive Director that nobody knows about.
Yeah.
That's part of your job.
Yeah,
We think you just plan the annual meeting, and that's all you do, right? Is there one other thing that you would want members to know that is a part of your job that nobody knows about?
Yeah. One thing that AFS does that you may not know about, and it's actually grown to be a fairly important source of income for us. That's not the only important thing about it, but it doesn't hurt. Is that AFS is called upon now about 40 or 50 times a year to provide sort of letters of support for the visa applications to the U.S. of artists who are being brought in by various organizations and communities to the U.S. from other countries to perform. And so it is performing artists and also visual artists. Lately, there's been, I think, every Chinese paper lantern artist in Eastern China, I believe, is in the U.S. at this point, because we've done dozens of these letters. But we are essentially the law firms that are handling the visa applications for these people contact us. And we work with them to provide it's called an advisory opinion letter that is pretty necessary if an artist from any tradition, I mean, it would be a folk artist or a modern dance instructor, wanted to come to the U.S. Those kinds of things are required, and we've sort of gotten to the point where we are a kind of go-to organization for doing that sort of thing and trying to help and facilitate those artists coming to the United States. From time to time, the American Federation of Musicians, the Musicians Union, gets upset about the fact that we're doing that, and they complain, and the number of those requests really goes down. But the State Department and Citizenship and Immigration Services and the federal government maintains us on their list, and so we do that. We do that quite a bit throughout the year.